All right, we are live with the Heptio ARC office hours. Um, those of you listening on the stream, all 11 of you currently, welcome. We're going to do quick introductions, and then we're going to show you how the live stream is going to work. So I'm George Castro. I'm going to be your host today. I'm the community manager at Heptio.
I'm Andy Goldstein. I'm the project lead for ARC.
And I'm Steve Chris. I'm an engineer on the ARC team at Heptio.
I'm Nolan Brubaker, also a engineer on the ARC team at Heptio.
Awesome. So the way this is going to work, we've been talking about how we could kind of help users in a more high bandwidth situation. Sometimes it's easier to explain technical problems when you could just talk about it. So we thought we would have a regular series where we can take user questions, answer them, talk best practices. We can go over the roadmap. We can show you cool demos and all that sort of thing. So after doing the first office hours, this is kind of the second one where we're shaking out the kinks. So the way it's going to work is we're currently live streaming on YouTube, and we'll be taking questions from Slack on the Kubernetes Slack, which is slack.kubernetes.io. If you go there, we have a #arc-dr channel. Or you could just ping us directly on Twitter. I'm watching the Twitter accounts now. And then feel free to just ask your questions in the channel. And we could just kind of, answer questions as they get addressed to us. For those of us joining us on YouTube in the archive, we are going to schedule these in advance and things like that. So you can click the subscribe and share button and things like that. And you'll always make sure that you get your notification when we go. Right now, we're thinking maybe doing these every other week or so. So we'll see how that goes. And with that, we have notes. There's a Google Doc that we tossed into the Slack channel so that people can swap URLs. If we have things that we discuss, we could just toss them in there and put them in the description. So for those of you listening on your device or something after the fact, can always go look stuff up. And with that, we are ready to go. Feel free to start asking your questions in the stream. In the meantime, Andy, Steve, or Nolan, do we have anything cool to talk about or discuss or announcements? I saw we did a point release the other day.
Steve, why don't you kick this off?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So yesterday we pushed out some container images and binaries for our first alpha for the 0.9.0 release. We've been working on this for the past couple of months, and we have a whole bunch of bug fixes and smaller features. But the big feature that we've been working on for this release is integrating Restic into ARC. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Restic, it's an open source tool for doing kind of generic file level backups. And so we have this integrated into ARC so that you can use it to take backups of all of your Kubernetes volumes using ARC. And so again, for those of you who have used ARC before, you know that we've had snapshot support for EBS volumes and Google persistent disks and Azure blob disks since we initially launched ARC, but we also wanted to be able to take backups of any kind of volume, whether it's a persistent volume that doesn't have integrated snapshot support, or whether it's something like an empty dir volume or an NFS volume or anything else. And so with this latest release, we've integrated Restic to do just that. We have the first alpha out, and we definitely want folks to take it for a spin and give us any feedback on it. And I am going to do a demo in a minute or two, but definitely want to pause and see if anyone has any other questions or comments on that.
I think for right now, why don't we just go to the demo?
Sure. So give me a second here and I'll share my screen. All right, does that look good? Can everyone?
Looking great.
See, okay? All right. So I have an up and running Kubernetes cluster with the 0.9.0 alpha deployed in it. And I'm going to walk through kind of the core use case of using Restic with ARC. So the first thing I'm going to show you is that I have a namespace deployed here, which is just contains kind of a sample workload that I'll use to demonstrate the Restic capabilities. And on the bottom, I'm just tailing the Arc server log just so that we can sort of see what's going on a little bit as I walk through these steps. So within the workload namespace, I have a deployment, and this is just a sample workload. It's got a single pod here, and if I take a look at this deployment, it's not doing much. It's basically just running in a sleep loop. But the important part here is that I have two volumes mounted into it, volume 1 and volume 2, and they're both empty dir volumes. So obviously things that we wouldn't have snapshot support for with Arc. So the first thing I'm going to do is just exec into that pod and show you what's in here. So here is volume 1 and volume 2. These are where my directories are mounted. So I'm just going to go into these and create some data that we have to back up. So you can see right now it's completely empty. So this one, I'll just create a file. So now we have a foo file, and then I'll go into volume 2 and first just going to add git. And then I'm just going to clone Arc in here. Cool. So now we have Arc. If I go in here, we can see it's a working local repository. So I'm going to exit out of this pod. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a backup of that namespace. And before I do that, let me actually go back to the deployment. And what you see here is that in the pod template, I have an annotation on this pod. And this is basically what's going to tell Arc that I'd like to take Restic for backups of these two volumes. So you can see I just have a list of the volume names here, volume 1, volume 2. Now, in this case, they're empty dir volumes, but they could be any other type of volume that Kubernetes supports. So now when I go to execute a backup, call it demo workload, and I want to include the workload namespace, and that should be it. And so now the backup's running. You can see on the bottom in the log here, the backup's running, and this will just take a few seconds. So I'll pause here while this is running and see if there are any questions from anyone.
You have a question from Ross, asks, can I use Arc pre/post hooks with the new Restic feature?
Yeah, absolutely. So hooks would work just like they do for snapshots. So you can attach these to your pods, and if you need to do file system freezes or anything like that before and after taking a backup, that'll work just fine.
I have a question as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to get to this, but as far as, so I use Restic manually for a bunch of other stuff, and it's when you list your snapshots, you have to go back and clean them up in your bucket and whatnot. Do we provide any kind of life cycle management of these snapshots, or is that expected to be handled externally?
No, we do. So prior to Restic, Arc supported the concept of garbage collection for backups. And so if you have an Arc backup that has, say, EBS snapshots attached to it, when that backup expires and is garbage collected, we actually go out to AWS and delete those snapshots. And
Okay.
so we've done exactly the same thing for Restic. So the Restic backups that are associated with an Arc backup, when that backup gets garbage collected, they're also removed from the repository.
Okay. So as a new user, I should only just work with Arc itself and not try to
Exactly. Yeah.
skip Arc and do the Restic thing directly. If I can even do that. I don't.
Yeah, for the most part, you can control all of the Restic integration directly through the Arc CLI and through Arc. You don't really need to worry about the Restic backend, although you certainly can always access it through the Restic CLI if you want to. So,
okay, awesome.
Yeah. So, okay, so the backup is completed now. So just take a look at that. I think I only have one backup in here. It's completed. I guess the other thing I will show you, since we were just talking about the Restic CLI, is what the repository actually looks like through the Restic CLI. So I think I have this in here. So this is just a command to list all of the snapshots in a Restic repository. Now what you'll see here is that this repository is actually hosted in S3. So I'm running a cluster in AWS. And so I have the Restic backend in S3, just in a bucket that I've created. And you'll see that at the end here, I have a slash workload. And this means that I have a repository for the specific namespace that I'm working with. So we've decided to kind of separate Restic repositories so that you have one per namespace. Now, if I look at the snapshots that are in here, you'll see that I have two snapshots here. And the output's a little bit hard to read here, but this is the first one, this is the second one, and you'll see this one here is for volume 1, this one here is for volume 2. And each of the Restic snapshots or backups, kind of synonymous in the Restic world, have a number of tags that are associated with them so that we can sort of easily identify them and tie them back to Arc backups and to the workloads that they came from. So what I'm going to do now is actually just go ahead and delete the deployment and the pod from that namespace that I was working with to kind of simulate a disaster or a fresh start. So I'll just delete the deployment, the replica set, and the pod. And this is just going to take a minute for the pod to clean up. So again, take another pause and see if there are any other questions.
Yep, we have two more. What would be the correct procedure for rolling back to a point-in-time snapshot for an application? I.e. stuff got deleted that shouldn't have. Scale that stateful set down to 0, delete PVC and PV, initiate restore, and then scale back up?
I can take this one.
Mm-hmm.
So this is essentially what we're calling a data-only backup and restore. And it's not something that we've extensively tested, but we do have an open GitHub issue that's a feature request for doing data-only restores. So you maybe could try doing what you listed with scaling the stateful set down and then doing the restore. I'm not super confident that it would necessarily work, and I think this is definitely something that we are interested in adding support. So if you have ideas around what you'd like the user interface to look like, or any ideas really, please come look at the GitHub issue. We'll post a link to it in the office hours document, and we can continue the conversation there.
Yeah, awesome. And okay, thank you for putting the GitHub issue there in the notes, and we'll make sure that we publish that to the list. Okay, it looks like you're ready, Steve.
Yeah, so yep, so we got the deployment, the replica set, and the pod deleted from that namespace. So now I'm going to go ahead and execute a restore. And so a restore looks just like it always had. So we're going to say arc restore create from backup. What I called my backup, so demo workload. And that's it. And as soon as I execute this, I'm going to switch to just kind of watching the status of the deployment replica set and pod so we can see what's happening as the restore runs. So restore is running now, and I'm just gonna be watching this. So you can see immediately the deployment and replica set have been recreated. And then you also see down here that we have the pod, but you see that it's running in a init container. And so the init container is something that Arc is actually adding to this pod, and it's allowing the pod to wait for the Restic restore to complete. And so the workflow here is that we create the pod with the init container. That allows all of the volumes to be set up on the host. And then we're then actually running the Restic restore through an Arc daemon set pod that's running on each host. And so here we've got, you saw it just went through initializing and running. So the restore should be complete now. So just take a look there. You can see the restore completed, no warnings, no errors. And now if I exec back into that pod, we've got volume 1 and volume 2. If I go into volume 1, there's our foo file. hello world. And if I go into volume 2, we've got Arc, and there's our Arc Git repository. So Restic did all of that data backup and data restore, and it works kind of just like you would expect a snapshot to work. So hope everyone enjoyed the demo, and fire up any other questions you have.
Steve, do you want to just talk briefly about how we are implementing the backup and the restore using a privileged pod running as part of a daemon set?
Yeah, absolutely. So we thought about a few different ways for Restic to actually be able to access the data that it needed to be able to back up. But the approach that we've gone with for now is that we created a new daemon set that's running within the Arc namespace, and so we have one of these pods running on each node in the cluster. And those daemon set pods are mounting a host directory, mounting the var lib kubelet pods host directory. And so this gives these pods access to all of the volumes of the pods running on that node. And so when we are actually executing Restic backup and restore commands, those are happening in these daemon set pods and are basically taking backups or running restores against this host path directory. And so that's kind of how we've enabled sharing of the data between the actual workloads and Arc and the Restic CLI.
Okay, are we ready for more questions?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, sorry, lost my window there for a second. The question is, after restores, dis are named restore-UUID. Is this correct behavior, or should they be renamed to match previous names?
So we definitely need to have unique names for the persistent volumes that are created from snapshots when we're doing a restore. We may take the restore part out and just go with a randomly generated name. Basically, we have one feature request that we are quite interested in doing, which is essentially cloning a namespace and along with persistent volumes that are in use by that namespace into the same cluster. Persistent volumes are cluster scoped resources, which means they don't belong to any one namespace. And if you take a snapshot of a persistent volume and then you want to restore it into the same cluster without deleting anything, so it's kind of like a copy and paste, then we have to create a persistent volume with a new name because the old one's still there. We can't have the disk that's created in EBS, for example, use the same name because that would collide with the original one. So yes, it's intentional that we have unique names, and ideally, you shouldn't have to worry about the names. And we make every effort to put tags or labels or whatever is appropriate, either at the Kubernetes level or at the cloud provider level, so that you can identify a given name of a resource that may just be a bunch of random letters and numbers back to the backup or the restore or the original, some sort of original identifying information.
Yeah, this makes me wonder if there's like applications out there that kind of don't expect disks to be renamed this way.
I think if we're using
the Kubernetes level instead of the...
At the Kubernetes level, if you're using dynamic provisioning, the names of the persistent volumes are basically dynamically generated. So I think it's entirely appropriate to come up with our own names, whether it's restore - whatever, or just a random UUID. So yeah, I think if you worry about the tags and the labels and the Kubernetes resources themselves, I think that how we name the disks hopefully won't be an issue for you. If it is an issue, please let us know, and we'll see what we can do to help you out.
Yeah, sounds very interesting. All right, you guys, next question, or are we kicking back to Steve here? Okay, here's a question near and dear to my heart. Can I use this Restic feature to migrate cloud providers? I've known you, Steve, I've seen you demo this before.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So the answer is it depends right now. So if you're using volume types that are not specific to a cloud provider, so if you use the example I used and you just have some empty dir volumes that you want to migrate across a cloud provider, or maybe you're using NFS volumes or something else like that, the answer is yes. There's nothing that would prevent that from working across cloud providers. I think we'll probably be writing up some documentation and some descriptions of kind of the limitations of that, because it's certainly not expected to work in all cases, and it's not a specific scenario that we focused on during this release. But in theory, yes, the migration should be able to work, and we've certainly tested that with versions of this. If you're using EBS volumes or persistent disks, that's not going to work, because we don't have anything in Arc currently that can kind of translate, say, an EBS disk in your source cluster into a Google persistent disk in your target cluster. So although the data could in theory be restored, we don't have that logic to kind of convert from one type of PV to another type of PV. So that's definitely something that we have on our roadmap, and we're interested in doing more work on in the future. And certainly the Restic work potentially provides a foundation for that. So stay tuned for sure.
One thought that I just had there, Steve, is that we may want to find a way to allow the user to control if they want one of their EBS volumes to use an EBS snapshot or Restic. I don't think we have that level of control right now.
Yeah, it's sort of all or none right now. So I've certainly run using Restic to back up EBS volumes, but the way that I've done that is I've turned off snapshot support. I basically deleted my persistent volume provider from the config.
Yeah.
And so you can do that, but it's kind of an all or nothing thing. So
I know we have an open issue for exploring how to opt in or out of persistent volume snapshots. I think the user who filed that maybe had lots and lots of persistent volumes, but most of them were throwaway. And the ones where the data really mattered that they wanted backed up was a small subset of that. And so maybe we can loop into that feature request and take that into consideration for both controlling which volumes are in and out and which ones are Restic versus native.
Yeah, and as we saw in the demo, we've kind of gone with using annotations, at least for now, to control which volumes get Restic backups, and so we might want to just extend that to control what gets snapshotted, what gets Restic backed up, and what gets not backed up at all.
Yeah, I mean, we could do something like if it's got the Restic backup annotation for a volume, then that takes precedence over the native plugins.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, what's next, George?
Sure. So the Restic support looks interesting, but fairly involved. Do you see any additional meaty integrations like this?
I wouldn't say that there's anything that's in my mind that is going to be a big integration that's coming up. We do have some big features that we are designing and will be working on as we move towards on the road to 1.0. One of the big ones is replication of backup data. So while it's not necessarily a meaty integration with a third-party tool such as Restic, it is a big chunk of work to be able to specify that you want to replicate your data, both the backup data and the persistent volume snapshots or Restic snapshots, from wherever they're originally backed up to additional locations. So the classic example there is if you've got all of your backups in a single data center and you lose connectivity to that data center, or maybe it's a region, it's AWS US East 1 or Google's US Central 1A or whatever, you want to have highly available backup data across multiple regions or data centers. So that would be a fairly involved feature that we're working on, but it's not necessarily an integration.
Would that cover the multi-cloud case as well if I wanted something in Google Central 1 and US East 1?
Maybe. That kind of remains to be seen at this point.
I'm just asking leading questions.
Yeah, we potentially, if you've got Restic going on and you're using that to back up, I imagine we potentially could have Arc orchestrate taking a backup that's in Restic on one cloud provider and migrating it over. But we'll see. That's definitely something we'll be exploring.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. What does the performance of the Restic backup and restore look like? How long does it take to do a gigabyte, let's say, or 10 gigs?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say we have detailed kind of performance numbers, but from experience, a gigabyte backup will take on the order of seconds to maybe a minute or two. One nice thing about Restic is that it actually does differential backups, and so your first backup, it's going to obviously have to go through all the data and back that up. While it's doing that, it does some deduplication of the data so that it uses as little space as possible in your backend. But when it goes to do the second backup, it's essentially only going to need to back up whatever data has changed since the previous backup. And so typically for data that's not turning over all the time between backups, you're going to see subsequent backups be much faster. And then restore performance is definitely a little bit slower than backup. So, to restore a gigabyte might take on the order of 5 to 10 minutes, ballpark. But there is a PR that's in flight right now to make some pretty significant improvements in the performance of that. I've been playing with it and testing it out, and it seems like it's made on the order of a 10x improvement for my test cases. So we're definitely eagerly awaiting that feature getting merged into Restic and hoping to help out with some testing there. So so definitely stay tuned.
And for those of you not familiar with Restic, it's encrypted at rest in the cloud provider, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
I like that. Okay, moving on. Question, can Arc be configured to look cluster-wide for backups rather than for a specific namespace? Right now, we run with the arguments -- namespace core -- system. However, we'd like users to be able to bundle their own backup configs in their own namespaces. They happen to run an app per namespace.
So right now, no. So Arc, the server component of Arc runs as cluster admin unless you've configured it to have lesser privileges. And we need cluster admin in order to be able to restore anything and everything in the cluster. We have two issues that I think Nolan has linked in the document. One on backup templates, which we may or may not do. The idea around that is that an application developer and operator may be more intimately familiar with how to back up that application's resource than a centralized cluster backup administrator potentially would. And so if we were to add support for backup templates, then whoever's responsible for deploying the application could also create a backup template and then tell the backup operator, here is my backup template. So the backup operator would still be responsible for creating a scheduled backup or a one-off backup, but instead of them having to specify all of the details, it could point at a backup template that maybe is in a different namespace. We need to think through the security issues around that. Like I said, Arc is cluster admin, so if we were to change Arc so that it looked at any and all namespaces for backups and restores, then any user could create a backup and ask for it to back up the entire cluster or to go back up some other namespace's secrets that maybe they don't have permission to get access to. And so we are very security conscious and want to make sure that we don't have those escalations. So there is also an issue that I've linked in the document, number 18 on our GitHub repository, for multi-tenancy support, where we created it a long time ago when we first started working on Arc, but it was not an initial focus for us. So if there are people in the community who really need multi-tenancy support, where you want individual users in different namespaces to be able to request backups without privilege escalations, we would definitely be interested to hear from you, especially if you have any specific needs that are more specific than just we want multi-tenancy. So definitely looking for specific feedback there.
All right, and that is the end of the current questions. For those of you who are just joining us, you could join us on the #arc-dr channel on the Kubernetes Slack. That's slack.kubernetes.io. Let me check Twitter. No one's really asked us questions yet on Twitter, but we are monitoring that. And then we definitely have questions in Slack as well, as long as a link to this Google Note, Google document will be publishing. All the notes here from the session, as well as the video, probably, I don't know, half hour after we go live. So with that, it looks like more questions are coming in. Where those are in, crew, is there anything else that you want to bring up while the...
Yeah, so with the Restic integration, as Steve mentioned, we released an alpha of 0.9 yesterday. We have some documentation in our GitHub repository that describes how to test it. We need your help. This was, as mentioned earlier, a pretty meaty integration. So there may be bugs. And if you have time, please take it out for a spin. Try some backups, try some restores, try to do funky things that break it. And please let us know what your experiences are. We definitely are not ready to call this feature complete, which is why we released an alpha. So some of the additional things that we'll be doing include key rotation support. So right now you have to initialize an encryption key for each namespace that you want to use Restic to back up. And that's a one-time operation right now. And there's currently no way to change that. So we will be adding key rotation support into Arc, so you can administer your Restic repositories a little bit more easily. And we're probably going to have a few other things here and there, such as making it easy to annotate your deployments, jobs, pods, etc., to tell them which backup or which volumes to back up with Restic. So if you have any ideas for additional user experience and user interface improvements, please let us know. We will keep the alpha open for probably a week or two, and we really do hope that we get your feedback in between now and when we actually cut the final 0.9 release.
And
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add on one thing, which is that, for those of you who aren't ready to use the Restic integration initially, it's certainly opt-in. It's not required to be used. And if you don't choose to use it, it won't affect kind of any of the existing use cases. So definitely opt in, but hopefully it adds value for a lot of you out there.
Sweet. All right, we have two questions coming in. The first one is, what's the Arc Twitter handle? Simple there, at HeptioArc. I've tossed that in the notes there. Question, has there been any discussion on pre/post backup plugins instead of resource space being added in? This was one where we were thinking of alerting on failed backups or some cleanup.
Yeah, so I can take that. Pre and post backup hooks exist that let you run inside of a container to do some custom logic. Per pod. That would be that'd be one way to do this kind of stuff today. We also have a PR open for gathering metrics that you could send somewhere to alert off failed backups if they don't match the attempted backups. There's stuff that's more specific. We haven't really discussed it. Oh. Pre-post backup hooks don't exist.
Yeah, so we support doing hooks at the pod level.
Yes.
The question is, can I
for the whole backup?
Can I do it for the entire backup?
Not currently.
So we've had questions. We've had this question before, and we may add support for pre and post backup hooks, but if you're comfortable working in the Kubernetes client ecosystem, you can write code that will watch for backups to change status, just like you would watch for pods to change status or whatever. And so it could be done as an external integration. You could write a separate piece of code to watch for backups. If you feel strongly that that's something that you need, we can definitely take it into consideration. I believe we have an open issue for it. I'll go hunt it down. And then alternatively, Nolan, I think you were mentioning metrics as well. So once we get the metrics integrated and we have an initial pull request open for it, if you already have Prometheus and Grafana and any other portions of the monitoring and metrics stack that relates to that, you certainly could alert off of those as well.
Okay, just reminding people you can just post your question directly in Slack as well. We can copy it over into the notes. No problem there. But it looks like the initial flurry of questions is stymied. Do we have anything else we want to show or discuss here while we ask people for more questions if you have them? Do we have anything roadmap-wise that we want to hint or tease people with?
So 0.9 is Restic. 0.10 will be backup replication as the main feature focus there. We also, I mentioned wanting to be able to clone namespaces with the PVs. We don't have a firm release date for that or which release it'll be in, but that'll be another big feature that I know people are looking forward to. Also metrics, of course, and we are lucky enough to have a community member working on that pull request. So cool. We love having community members come and help us out. So I see a question, any idea when metrics might make its way in? We most likely will probably get the initial implementation in with 0.9. If it doesn't make 0.9, it'll be right after on the master branch. That will not be all the metrics. We'll start with just a few and then continue to add more over the next release or so. So I would expect that either 0.9 or right after.
Yeah, let me just encourage those of you that are looking to participate. We love pull requests, things like that. And I even send you a t-shirt and stickers and all that stuff. So absolutely feel free to get involved. Metrics 1, hold on, the notes are just, everyone's copying and pasting. So JRNT30 asks, this is a more community-based question. I enjoy these conversations and I'm curious if there's any interest in more pairing related things to get people actively contributing to the project via code. Part of the hook for me with ARC is just the friendly faces. Where to invest my time is really driven by some of that collaborative effort and as a way to network. Andy, so I think this ties in with what we were discussing privately before the meeting was, this can not only just be office hours Q&A, right? We could have this kind of just be like a public stand-up where people, if they want to join, they could join the Zoom meeting themselves.
Yeah, I think similar to the Kubernetes SIG meetings that are either weekly or bi-weekly or whatever frequency, sure. We will probably explore doing that, something like that for ARC. So I would hope that we'll be able to get our act together and put together a schedule that is friendly for as many time zones as possible. I know time zones are hard, so we may have to alternate some times to work a little bit more for Europe. I think, unfortunately, given that the core ARC team is in the US, trying to do some of the more Asia-friendly times is going to be difficult for us. But we certainly can alternate between morning and afternoon East Coast times, for example, which would line up with US and Europe at least. But we definitely would be interested in having more community engagement, helping us direct what features we can add and what functionality. So I think having open design meetings would be a pretty cool thing to do.
Yeah, so I think what I'll do after this is probably get feedback on how this time slot worked for everybody. And then maybe look at, every other week or something like that. Maybe we can alternate, one time European friendly, one time, US friendly. We can certainly be flexible there. And maybe every once in a while try to do, an Asia friendly one. We could definitely, we definitely get feedback and metrics from users. So we're able to plan smartly there on when best to schedule. Actually, I think that's how we ended up in this time slot. That's why this is kind of split the difference between Europe and the US. So I'll definitely get on that. Thank you very much for that feedback. Justin, thank you. Any other questions or things to discuss?
That might be it for today.
It's kind of the awkward thing. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us. So what we'll do here is we'll post the notes out. Thank those of you that joined us on YouTube. We had a peak of 18 people at the same time. So thank you very much for joining the live stream. We know these can be fun, and thanks to all of you who are subscribed to the YouTube channel. Like we said, please click the subscribe button on the channel. Usually we start the stream about 10 minutes before. That should give you a little bit of warning. And then once we get the schedule down, we're going to start to do a better job as far as regularly tweeting ahead of time and things like that to help plan. I already got some feedback that a calendar entry for people to join in might be more useful. So we're definitely looking at making this easier for you. So with that, thank you very much to our panel of Arc Upstream experts. And thank all of you for tuning in. You'll find us in #arc-dr on the Kubernetes Slack, which is slack.kubernetes.io. So with that, thank you, and we'll see you all soon.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.